Republicans have lost the popular vote in 7 out of the last 8 presidential elections. That has to change. Joe Biden's record is abysmal, but that shouldn't come as a surprise. The Washington establishment has failed us over and over and over.
Nikki Haley 的无政策运动。从这一系列有关共和党初选领先者的视频中可以清楚地看出，许多候选人在没有任何明确政策提案的情况下参加竞选。事实证明，许多问题在共和党选民中存在分歧，例如妇女的堕胎权、外交政策，特别是围绕对乌克兰的支持以及与中国的竞争，以及围绕特朗普在1月6日叛乱中应负的责任的辩论。但这些问题被推到了第一次共和党辩论的最前沿，代价是质疑候选人的个人政策提案。
That no one is telling the American people the truth. The truth is that Biden didn't do this to us. Our Republicans did this to us too. When they passed that $2.2 trillion COVID stimulus bill, they left us with 90 million people on Medicaid, 42 million people on food stamps. No one has told you how to fix it. I'll tell you how to fix it. They need to stop the spending. They need to stop the borrowing. They need to eliminate the earmarks that the Republicans brought back in. And they need to make sure they understand these are taxpayer dollars. It's not their dollars.
目前，尼基·黑利是共和党初选中第4受欢迎的候选人，仅次于特朗普、德桑蒂斯和拉马斯瓦米。尽管尼基·黑利将自己描绘成共和党初选中特朗普之后的4位领跑者中最温和的候选人，但在他的网站上，他没有为自己的竞选活动提出明确的政策建议。拉马斯瓦米提出了比特朗普更进一步推进美国优先的25项政策承诺，德桑蒂斯则提出了3项主要政策建议：停止入侵、使命第一以及他的经济独立宣言。黑利只在他的网站上展示了他的结果记录。本成果记录列出了黑利在2010年至2017年担任南卡罗来纳州州长，以及随后在2017年至2018年特朗普领导下担任美国驻联合国大使期间取得的成就。创造就业机会，让政客承担责任，为未出生的孩子挺身而出，打击非法移民，保护我们的选举，扩大教育自由，勇敢地面对联邦政府，捍卫我们的第2修正案权利，帮助退伍军人，危机中的领导，改革联合国，保卫以色列，废除伊朗协议，倡导人权，对中国采取强硬态度，制裁朝鲜，对俄罗斯采取强硬态度，拉丁美洲领先。在很多方面，海利作为南卡罗来纳州州长的简历读起来很像德桑蒂斯作为佛罗里达州州长的简历。那么，让我们来探讨一下这份简历的一些亮点。创造就业机会。2010年，当他当选南卡罗来纳州州长时，失业率高达 11.3%。他强调，在他的任期结束时，南卡罗来纳州的工作人口比历史上任何时候都多，南卡罗来纳州的失业率也很高，超过全国平均水平。虽然这是事实，但南卡罗来纳州的就业增长或多或少与全国平均水平相当。海利对南卡罗来纳州工会的反对也是史无前例的。他曾一度表示，我们不鼓励任何有工会的公司来到南卡罗来纳州，因为我们不想污染水源。
You know, when you have a president that's constantly saying, go union, this is what you get. The unions get emboldened and then they start asking for things that, you know, that companies have a tough time doing. And so I don't think government should get involved in this. These are private sector matters. But I do think the tone of how a president talks about unions and how a president emboldens them does play a role in this. And we're seeing what Biden has done play a role in this.
为未出生的孩子挺身而出。通过为未出生的孩子挺身而出，海利意在强调他在禁止妇女堕胎方面的记录。在最高法院于2022年6月推翻罗伊诉韦德案之前，海利在20周后宣布他所在的州堕胎为非法。 在第一次共和党初选中，他没有承诺联邦全面禁止堕胎，称这是各州权利的问题。打击非法移民。海利在他的竞选网站上夸口说，2011年，他签署了该国最严厉的移民法之一，赋予执法部门更大的权力来检查人们是否是非法移民。这些法律要求警察在怀疑有人非法进入该国，例如在交通拦截或逮捕期间，实致电联邦移民机构。他还成立了一个秘密的移民执法部门，其既定任务是追捕暴力团伙，毒枭和人口贩运者，但实际上，《华盛顿邮报》和《信使报》的一项调查显示，被捕的绝大多数是西班牙裔工薪阶层，他们使用了伪造的文件以及受聘工作所需的身份证。危机中的领导。海利描述了他作为南卡罗来纳州州长所面临的危机，一场白人至上主义枪击事件，警察开枪，飓风，2场冰雹，还有1000年一遇的洪水。他提到的白人至上主义者枪击事件发生在2015年，当时白人至上主义者迪伦·鲁夫 Dylan Roof 杀害了查尔斯顿一个黑人占多数的教堂的9名成员，这促使他最终降下了州议会大厦前悬挂的邦联旗帜。枪击事件发生前，他支持悬挂邦联旗帜。在他宣布撤除国旗的演讲中，他没有承认在州政府大楼前悬挂邦联旗帜是对白人至上的公开支持。2015年，半岛电视台发表了一篇文章，介绍南方贫困法律中心如何追踪南卡罗来纳州19个活跃的仇恨团体。2022年，南方贫困法律中心正在追踪30个活跃的仇恨团体。尽管降下南方邦联旗帜在视觉上象征着对白人至上的胜利，但在不承认它是仇恨象征的情况下降下旗帜，只会让南卡罗来纳州的白人至上主义者得以蓬勃发展，并聚集在地下团体中。担任驻联合国大使的成就。名单上的最后8项凸显了黑利作为美国驻联合国大使在特朗普政府中的角色。特别是黑利呼吁人们抵制北京2022年冬季奥运会，并对中国采取强硬态度，攻击中国在新疆对维吾尔人进行种族灭绝。这体现了共和党对中国的敌意，他们将中国视为美国的主要经济和政治竞争对手。黑利和其他共和党领先候选人一样，指责中国抢走了美国的就业机会。尼基·黑利 Nikki Haley 以他的结果记录而不是政策建议为竞选依据，这体现了美国政治中的一种趋势，即候选人根据模糊或不明确的政策建议，或根本没有任何政策来竞选。特朗普背后的共和党领跑者罗恩·德桑蒂斯在他的网站上向选民做出的实质性承诺很少，他的政策停止入侵、使命第一和经济独立宣言主要侧重于批评拜登的政策，而不是介绍德桑蒂斯自己的政策。新泽西州前州长克里斯蒂 Chris Christie 的竞选网站上也没有任何政策建议。尽管拜登的竞选活动自4月以来一直在进行，但他的网站上没有关于2024年竞选活动的政策建议。目前尚不清楚这对第二次辩论意味着什么，主持人是否会向候选人提出更尖锐的问题，以确定他们的确切政策建议是什么。共和党和民主党都已转向关注个性和情感，而非政策的政治。尼基·海利 Nikki Haley 会从第二次辩论中无效的政策中受益吗？
The fact is that no one is telling the American people the truth.
感谢观看，这里是华尔街前线。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。从疫情结束之后，美国的写字楼市场一直没有复苏。6月份写字楼空置率达到30年来的最高水平 18.2%。而《华尔街日报》最近发表了这样一篇深度报告，叫做“你觉得美国写字楼市场不好吗？那么看看中国，中国的情况要比美国更加的糟糕”。随着中国经济面临多年来最严重的放缓，深圳等曾经繁荣的城市大量办公空间空置，租金不断下跌。数据显示，截至6月份，中国18个主要城市近 24% 的办公楼空间闲置。然而，与美国不同的是，中国的办公楼市场并没有转向居家办公模式的重大转变。而在美国，很多企业在疫情当中改为居家办公之后，现在很多员工不再回到办公室上班，或者有些企业允许美国的员工一周中一半时间可以居家办公。这种办公模式减少了西方企业对办公空间的需求，而中国的情况完全不同。中国正面临着一个更基本的房地产问题，那就是开发商建造了过多的办公楼，而现在中国经济太差，无法消化它们。中国经济最近一个季度环比几乎没有增长，7月份青年失业率创历史新高，私营企业疲软也抑制了对新租赁的需求。而今年还将有一波新的办公楼投入市场，将令市场更加的暗淡。世邦魏理仕的亚太研究主管 Henry Chin 说，中国的写字楼市场已经接近底部，但是还没有看到底部。这一困境与中国住宅房地产行业的问题相类似，由于开发商建造了过多的公寓楼，加上政府收紧信贷来冷却过热的市场，中国住宅房地产行业陷入了低迷。现在分析师普遍还不太担心中国写字楼市场的影响，因为这一市场的规模要小于住宅房地产行业。但是近年来写字楼市场实际上合计占中国国内生产总值的 20% 或更多。中国大多数写字楼资产由房地产开发商、保险公司和腾讯等科技巨头在国内投资拥有，但是一些大型外国公司也在中国地产繁荣时期进入了中国商业地产市场，比如说投资机构贝莱德和美国开发商铁士门等等。分析师表示，这些大型投资者拥有足够多的财力来承受办公资产的部分损失。尽管如此，高空置率仍然表明经济的失灵，投资者正在倍感压力。中国商业地产开发巨头 SOHO 中国最近公布，今年上半年净利润同比大跌 93%， 约为190万美元。SOHO 称，未来3年随着大批新增供应陆续入市，租金和出租率仍将继续承压。许多深受近几年疫情管控之苦的中小企业也在今年缩减了办公空间。在中国提供汽车测试软件的德国企业 Peak Solution 的总经理就表示，为了节约成本，公司在疫情期间缩小了上海办公室的规模，搬到了一座新的租金要低 30% 的写字楼中。他表示，公司在2021年末从之前的写字楼搬走的时候，所在楼层约有一半的办公室都是空置的，而且后来空置率很可能又上升了。同时，这家德国小型企业的经理也表示，目前正在努力寻找新客户，但是在中国当前的经济形势下，这很困难。他说，目标是撑过今年。房地产数据显示，中国的中部大城市武汉有 6.3 万平方米的甲级写字楼今年进入市场，导致武汉的光谷商业圈的空置率在6月份达到超过 30% 的历史高位。光谷是武汉一个深受科技公司青睐的区域。另外，数据还显示，在中国南方的另一个科技中心深圳，截至6月份，办公楼空置率超过了 25%， 接近2020年疫情传播初期的高点。腾讯和华为等科技巨头的总部都在深圳。腾讯自2011年以来一直在租用深圳一栋写字楼的15个楼层。该写字楼的出租方朗科科技在今年1月份的一份公告中表示， 腾讯已经提前3年终止了租赁合同。朗科科技称，腾讯要提前终止合同的原因是经济下行压力加剧和消费增长放缓。腾讯的发言人今年则回应称，此次退租属于办公楼的正常调整。根据数据，在科技企业纷纷撤离的推动下，北京第2季度写字楼空置率也升至 18%， 几乎是2018年水平的3倍。世邦魏理仕表示，截至6月份，中国全国写字楼平均月租金与2019年相比下降了近 7%。而在中国经济陷入困境之际，有一项业务正在当中蓬勃发展，那就是在香港向中国大陆人销售保险。近几个月来，内地游客挤满了香港保险代理人的办公室，并且在银行缴费处排起了长队。在北京结束疫情管控以及与香港的边境重新开放之后，香港以投资为重点的保单销售迅速复苏。往往当人们对中国经济健康状况产生怀疑时，保险需求就会上升。人民币对美元今年大幅贬值，于是大陆客户利用香港的保单来分散人民币投资。香港的保险以美元或港币计价，港币又与美元挂钩。美国股市今年也是呈上升趋势，而中国股市则持续低迷。香港保险行业的回春一大受益人就是汇丰银行。总部位于伦敦的汇丰银行将亚洲视为它最大的市场，而今年的中国经济放缓令汇丰银行十分头疼，而现在保险业务的复苏令汇丰喜出望外。汇丰银行一直希望减少对利率敏感业务的依赖，比如说对企业和家庭的贷款业务，而现在汇丰已经加入了传统上由大型保险公司，比如说永邦和保诚主导的市场，参与保险行业的竞争。而汇丰银行现在的董事长马克塔克也曾经担任这2家保险巨头的首席执行官。最近由于欧美加息，汇丰银行的股价今年飙升，但是人们也担心利率回落的时候汇丰会如何表现，因此汇丰等银行急需创造其他的收入来源，比如说保险。最近的保险购买可能一部分是受到疫情期间无法满足的需求的推动，很多想买保险的大陆人在过去3年都无法出境，但是境外分析师也表示，亚洲各地也存在着长期的增长动力，许多国家缺乏强有力的社会福利保障。汇丰银行的香港保险业务在疫情前已经出现增长，而现在似乎正在恢复这种增长。汇丰银行上个月表示，截至6月份的3个月内，汇丰在香港的人寿保险收入较去年同期增加了约2亿美元。汇丰银行的财务主管在业绩会上告诉投资者，汇丰银行最近在香港出售的新保单中有近1/3是由中国大陆客户所购买的。在整个香港，保险业的发展速度都快于疫情前的水平。香港保险业监管机构的数据显示，今年上半年向中国大陆赴港游客销售的保单新增保费总额约为40亿美元，较2019年同期增长超过 20%。保诚集团和友邦保险也强调了来自中国大陆的资金流入激增。友邦保险的 CEO 今年宣布，在来自中国大陆游客大量业务的推动下，友邦保险今年上半年在香港的新业务价值比去年增长了1倍多。香港的银行业也因此广泛受益，因为内地客户需要使用香港本地账户以美元或者港元来支付保费，并且还需要大量存入美元计价的定期存款。中国对资本外流一直实行严格的控制，允许个人每年向海外转移不超过5万美元。而在香港购买保险是中国公民将资金用于全球长期投资的一种方式。保险代理人和经纪人表示，在香港销售的深受中国内地客户欢迎的保单，实际上是一种储蓄产品，只不过兼具人寿保险和重大疾病保单的功能。客户支付保费多年，保险公司将保费投资于不同的资产，以获得较长时期的回报。客户随后可以将这笔钱用于退休、子女教育或者延期年金。2年前，汇丰银行承诺5年内要斥资超过35亿美元建设其亚洲财富业务。从那时起，他已经雇佣了数千名员工从事亚洲财富业务。在中国大陆，汇丰已经在至少6个城市聘请了1400多名理财经理，通过大陆的分支机构从事理财业务，销售保险，并且提供投资建议。 不知道观众朋友近期有没有购买保险呢？我身边的确有很多朋友在大陆的朋友都是去香港进行了保险的配置。当然，在这里我们不是软广，只是跟大家分享一下近期的财经趋势。感谢您收看今天的新风视线，这里是华尔街电视。如果喜欢，记得点赞、打赏，并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
One decade ago, Zhou Mingwei, in his capacity as director of the China Foreign Languages Publishing Administration, was a guest of honor at a book launch hosted by the Chinese Consulate General in New York. The event saw attendance from senior Chinese diplomats and ex-U.S. government dignitaries. Zhou Mingwei, exuding versatility and eloquence, engaged in conversations in impeccable English. This might be just one of his many visits to the U.S. over the past 13 years. But there was a distinct difference this time. He was no longer a central figure in China's Taiwan policy-making process. Title 1: Zhou Mingwei, the best salesman of China. Back in 2000, Zhou Mingwei was indisputably an emerging luminary. At just 45, he took on the role of Deputy Director General of the Chinese Communist Party's Taiwan Affairs Office, a rank equivalent to that of a vice minister. In that capacity, he was responsible for mediating communications between the United States and China concerning Taiwan issues. Typically, such a position was reserved for officials around 60 years of age. Nevertheless, Zhou Mingwei's exceptional credentials made him an ideal fit. His academic journey took him through elite institutions in both China and the U.S., where he honed his expertise in international politics and American studies. Between 1996 and 2000, he was the go-to person in the Shanghai municipal government for liaising with international dignitaries. His fluent English, polished at Harvard, was described as hot green tea with honey by a Time magazine journalist. So impressed by Zhou Mingwei's adeptness at engaging with foreigners, one U.S. official even labeled him the best salesman the Chinese have. Before Zhou Mingwei's ascent, Wang Huning, another intellectual prodigy from Shanghai, had already established himself in Beijing as the deputy director of the CCP's Policy Planning Office. Both Zhou Mingwei and Wang Huning, graduates of Fudan University, were widely seen as rising political stars. While Wang Huning's career continued its upward trajectory, reaching the top echelons of China's leadership, Zhou Mingwei's path took an unexpected turn in December 2003. He was reassigned to the obscure Foreign Languages Publishing Administration as its deputy director. The government has remained tight-lipped about this shift. One theory suggested that Zhou Mingwei's stance on Taiwan was perceived to be too conciliatory. It posited that his inability to prevent then-Taiwanese President Chen Shui-bian from advancing a referendum agenda might have caused his sidetracking. Another theory hinted at lifestyle issues, specifically extramarital affairs, as a potential reason. There were also whispers of potential breaches in national security. However, it was clear that whatever led to Zhou Mingwei's reassignment was not a political death knell. He maintained his vice-ministerial rank, and, 6 years later, was promoted to the directorship of the Publishing Administration, a position he held until his 2017 retirement. Title 2: Xin Guofang, the popular seasoned diplomat. Much like Zhou Mingwei, Xin Guofang had his moments in the limelight. In 1984, he became secretary to the soon-to-be appointed minister, Xian Qichen, later known as the godfather of China's diplomacy. A decade on, Xin Guofang was promoted to the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and later took up the mantle of ambassador for the PRC's permanent mission to the UN. By 2003, Xin Guofang, then 50, was appointed Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs. Ranked first among the 4 assistant ministers, he was anticipated to become vice minister in short order. Notably, 2 previous foreign ministry spokespersons, Xian Qichen and Li Zhaoxing, had already climbed the ranks to become ministers of foreign affairs. As a seasoned diplomat, Xin Guofang was a favorite among foreign journalists. Not only was he fluent in English, but he also had a command of French and Spanish. Beyond his linguistic talents, Xin Guofang was adept at playing both the guitar and the violin and was said to be a skilled dancer. Despite the strictures of his official role, he managed to forge rapport with many journalists, standing out as one of the few Chinese officials willing to dine one-on-one with foreign correspondents. Xin Guofang approached his duties with patience and remarkable composure. With frequent appearance on Chinese state TV throughout the 1990s, he enjoyed a certain celebrity status in China. Yet, as noted by a Straits Times correspondent, there is no trace of self-importance in him. In December 2005, Xin Guofang's career trajectory shifted abruptly. He transitioned from his prominent diplomatic role to become the chief editor at World Knowledge Publishing House. Similar to Zhou Mingwei's reassignment, the reasons behind Xin Guofang's demotion remained cloaked in mystery. When questioned, Qin Gang, the foreign ministry spokesperson at the time, emphasized it was a routine job transfer, offering no further details. The lack of transparency fueled a whirlwind of speculation and rumor. Some whispered it was tied to lifestyle issues, pointing to his close ties to many journalists. Others more dramatically insinuated espionage involvement, suggesting he might have divulged critical national secrets. In a 2008 interview with China Newsweek, Xin Guofang addressed these circulating tales. "There have been countless rumors of me being a spy, facing arrest, receiving a death sentence, even getting divorced 3 times, Xin Guofang remarked with a chuckle. "The truth is, I've never divorced, I've been with the same wife throughout." Yet, when probed about the true reasons behind his demotion, he replied with a light smile, "I don't quite understand it myself." Xin Guofang's responses lent credence to another theory, which suggested that his fall from favor was due to bureaucratic infighting. According to the Hong Kong-based newsweekly, Yazhou Zhoukan, Xin Guofang was edged out due to power jockeying within the ministry. The magazine indicated that, as early as his tenure as the deputy representative of China's permanent mission to the UN, Xin Guofang had multiple chances for promotion to assistant minister. Yet, every time an opportunity arose, anonymous reports about his lifestyle would find their way to the disciplinary departments and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs leadership, consistently thwarting his advancement. Title 3, Qin Gang, The Meteoric Rise and Uncertain Fall. Compared with Zhou Mingwei's and Xin Guofang's career trajectories, Qin Gang's rise through the ranks of China's foreign policy establishment was markedly faster. In late 2022, following a brief stint as ambassador to the U.S., Qin Gang was inducted into the powerful CCP Central Committee. Shortly after, he was appointed the foreign minister. Within just a few months, he climbed further, becoming a state councillor, thereby joining the ranks of the party and national leadership. Such meteoric advancement is a rarity in Chinese elite politics. To put this into perspective, his predecessor and ironically, his successor as well, Wang Yi, only attained the state councillor position 5 years after becoming foreign minister, and that was at the age of 65. In contrast, Qin Gang accomplished this by the age of 56. As spokesperson for the foreign ministry, Qin Gang was known to have started the wolf warrior diplomacy. That said, he did not exhibit the same level of arrogance or abrasiveness associated with other wolf warrior diplomats. Upon his appointment as ambassador to the U.S., he tried to present a warmer side of Qin's diplomacy, distancing himself from the aggressive wolf warrior approach. Upon taking on the role of foreign minister, he expressed effusive admiration for Americans. In fact, one of his first moves as foreign minister was to sideline the most outspoken wolf warrior spokesperson, Zhao Lijian. Qin Gang's tenure as foreign minister was nevertheless short-lived. Beginning in late June, he has conspicuously disappeared from the public view, with the government initially attributing his absence to health reasons. On July 25, the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress, China's legislative body, formally relieved Qin Gang of his ministerial duties. Yet, an official explanation for his ouster remained elusive. The Wall Street Journal reported that senior Chinese officials were informed in August that Qin Gang's lifestyle issues led to his removal. It also suggested that Qin Gang may be under investigation for possible breaches of national security. Financial Times further revealed that he had an affair with a prominent Chinese TV presenter and fathered a surrogate child in the United States. Title 4, Power, Politics, and Personal Lives. Such lifestyle issues, though, might simply be a smokescreen for the deeper power struggles inherent to China's elite politics. An old Chinese adage goes, "The tree that stands out in the forest will be destroyed by the wind," akin to the English saying, "The tallest nail gets hammered down." Those who rise quickly are often more exposed to criticisms and contentions, especially from rivals envious of their ascent. In China, where adultery can be punished under Communist Party rules, mere rumors of lifestyle issues can effectively tarnish one's reputation or weaken the backing they garner from their patrons. Moreover, rising stars like Zhou Mingwei, Xin Guofang, and Qin Gang, who champion a more moderate stance in China's foreign relations, often find themselves in a precarious position. In a country where nationalism is deemed the eternal political correctness, they are susceptible to criticisms from hardliners concerned about appearing soft on issues pertaining to the United States or Taiwan. The politics of power jockeying become even more toxic and unsavory when allegations of espionage or breaches of national secrets are introduced into the mix. Intriguingly, Qin Gang has maintained his roles as a member of the CCP Central Committee and State Councilor. Should investigations exonerate him from any national security breaches, he might be assigned to a less conspicuous role, similar to the paths taken by Zhou Mingwei and Xin Guofang. A rule of thumb in China's officialdom is that unless an official's missteps are truly politically or professionally charged, lifestyle issues alone will not be a career killer. Regrettably, this system also produces the Greshamian bad money drives out good, stymieing the rise of young, genuinely talented, and moderate voices within China's foreign policy apparatus.
I guess the starting point is, this is basically what we were reading this summer, that not only was China going through a bad economic patch, but that this was symbolic of deep underlying problems that implicate China's ability to keep growing and keep exerting influence in the world for years and decades to come. And if you want to be a little bit flippant about this, it's like basically we had 3 months or 4 months of bad economic data, and then people came out of the woodwork trying to establish that these 3 or 4 months of data justified grand narratives and stories that they've been telling for years and decades. And kind of this was their moment to say that, yes, we have now been proven correct in all of these critiques that we've had of the underlying structures of the Chinese economy. And to be frank, I think a lot of these arguments were trying to make a very small number of data points do an awful lot of work, right? There was a lot of grand narratives being to a fairly small evidentiary basis. But I think it is fair to say that, concerns about the sustainability of Chinese growth have been rising a number of years. Concerns about the ability of China to continue balancing between an authoritarian political system and a capitalist economic system have grown a lot as the political system has become much more authoritarian and much more personalized under Xi Jinping. So while I think a lot of the hyperventilating over the last few months was frankly not all that constructive, I do think that the underlying questions that people are anxious about are real and they're very serious. And so I think the question is to figure out, just what's the exact nature of these problems? What's the nature of the risks that are building up in China? And how close are we to some kind of major inflection point in the trajectory of Chinese growth. So just to summarize, any speech like this has to have its straw man. So here I have my straw man that I have put together, sort of my interpretations of other people's arguments. But broadly speaking, I think you can report three major descriptions of Chinese economic troubles this year. The first two are saying what we're seeing now is symptoms of these deep structural malaises, and so there's big problems. And the first one of these is what you could call the debt trap problem. There are different variants of this, but the basic idea is that for the last 15 years, China's growth has depended very heavily on investments in infrastructure and property. A lot of this was financed by debt. A lot of this debt is not repayable or is having difficulty being repaid now. And so China has built up this kind of unsustainable debt pyramid. And now the bill has come due, and China is basically stuck in a situation very similar to the situation of Japan in the early 1990s. And in fact, Richard Koo, the economist who came up with the description of the Japanese problems in the 1990s of a balance sheet recession, came out and he was asked, is China in a balance sheet recession? And he said, yes. So there is a school of thought that says basically what we're seeing here is the inevitable secular slowdown of China's growth trajectory because of the buildup of unsustainable debt. Second, even broader argument is one that was advanced most lucidly by Adam Posen in Foreign Affairs recently. And his argument is essentially the fact that consumers and entrepreneurs did not respond to the end of COVID restrictions in China by shooting the lights out and just booming back into revenge spending and revenge investment and dynamic growth. This proves that consumers and private entrepreneurs have lost confidence in the fundamental Chinese system. And so we now have the victory of Leninist political structures over the dynamic economy. And so China is now, again, stuck in a much, much lower growth trajectory because of the failure to come to a good reconciliation of its political and economic systems. Then there's another explanation, which is a little bit more, it's a little bit more contingent, I guess you could say, or it's not so much of a grand narrative, it's a little bit more empirical. And basically it just adds up all of the various reasons why this year turned out to be, very disappointing. So you had a government that really didn't put much money into consumers' pockets during the COVID lockdowns. The end of the COVID restrictions in China was very chaotic. There was a lot of confusion in the first part of this year about what government policy was going to be. There's a sense that probably there does need to be a little bit more government stimulus to get economic growth going, but the government, for whatever reason, doesn't want to do that. And this was combined with the fact that exports, which had boomed in the previous 2 years because of increased demand for electronics and all kinds of other stuff that China makes, had slowed down. So you had various kinds of miscellaneous domestic problems, some bad policy choices, and combining with, just by luck of timing, with a slowdown in exports. And so, and on top of this, you have the pressure on foreign companies to invest less in China because of US politics. And so all of these things sort of combine together to produce a disappointing outcome. And the recipe for solving this is basically the government just needs to step in and do more stimulus. And I think there are, frankly, a lot of people in China who would subscribe to some variant of this view, that this is not sort of a grand moment, secular turning point. This is just sort of a bad combination of factors, which requires more skillful macro management than we have seen so far. I guess my conclusion on this is that all of these different explanations do have a piece of the reality of what's going on. I wouldn't sort of dismiss any of them out of hand. It's clear that China for years has been building up significant systemic debt problems. That is true. It has been clear for decades that there is a very uncomfortable balancing act between the Communist Party's demand for complete political control and their attempt to create a dynamic, innovative economy. Those things don't naturally live together too comfortably. And it's also very clearly the case that you just have a number of individual factors that happen to combine this year for a bad outcome. But I don't think it's enough, and I think we can come up with a better way to describe what's going on in China. First step towards this is to understand where the problems in these various narratives lie. So if you look at the story that, China today is basically like Japan in 1990, superficially, there's a little bit of resemblance there in the sense that they were both high debt economies. They both had big property bubbles. And the resemblances break down pretty quickly after that. So this is one illustration of part of it, which is just the asset price bubble that you saw in Japan in the 1980s was many, many, many times larger than the asset price bubble that we've seen in China. So yes, there clearly are some issues with the Chinese property market that are quite serious and are going to take a while to resolve. But we are not seeing the kind of just extraordinary misvaluation of underlying assets that you saw in Japan. The other, I think, critical difference is that if you look at the total sort of the political economy of Japan then versus China today, it's quite different. And in Japan, not only did you have a big property bubble, but you had banks that owned the shares of companies that owned the shares of banks. So the balance sheets of corporate Japan and financial Japan were fundamentally intertwined, and everything was collateralized by land values, which went completely crazy in the late 1980s. And so what happened is that when that bubble popped and the asset values came down, the balance sheet of the entire country basically came down as one. And this is what Richard Koo described in his book about Japan in the 1990s. China, and I'll get back to this later, is a more fragmented system. And I think it's a little bit of an error to assume that debt in one part of the country necessarily has an impact on another part of the system that is in other ways largely unconnected from it. In fact, Chinese policymakers have been pretty careful to ensure that the kinds of cross-shareholding structures that exist in Japan were not permitted in China. So the corporate and the financial systems were different. And so I think that enables a very different kind of solution to the problem. First of all, it's a different problem, and it creates different solutions than was the case in Japan. If you look at corporate China, and I will admit, this is only the listed firms, so there's like a gigantic universe of non-listed firms out there. But if you look at listed firms, what's very striking is that they have been deleveraging their balance sheets basically for a decade, which is not as surprising if you've sort of been following Chinese policy. For the entire time that Xi Jinping has been in office since 2013, and especially since late 2016, financial risk and excessive leverage has been a big target of the regulators. And they've put a lot of pressure on companies in different sectors at different times to cut back on debt, with mixed success, but the trend is very clear. So it really is not the case that if you look at the listed universe, that Chinese corporations are burdened by unmanageable levels of debt. Now, if you get into unlisted state-owned enterprises, particularly at the local level, very different story. But the closer you get to the really dynamic, productive sectors of the economy, basically the less debt you see. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about how we talk about this. China has a lot of debt. It's not just one undifferentiated blob of debt. It's debt that exists in certain places, has certain specific, often quite large impacts. It has some clear macro spillovers, but it is not a comprehensive shroud hanging over all of economic activity. So that's the balance sheet recession story. Now, the story about, people in China have lost confidence in the government. There's some real truth to this. So my last trip to China was in April. I spent a month there. And the first quarter of this year actually was pretty good. But people were beginning to get an inkling that, the recovery was just not as robust as they had hoped. And I was at a couple of events where there were private sector people, and they were complaining that they just were not seeing very much consumer demand. They didn't feel that the economy was very vibrant, and so they were reluctant to invest. They were reluctant to hire new staff. There's also anyone who spends much time talking to private entrepreneurs in China will pick up that there is a lot of suspicion, hostility / hatred of the Communist Party, the government, a lot of fear that Xi Jinping's obsession with control is just going to make their life a lot more difficult. So there's no question that anecdotally, that there are certain areas where sentiment in China has become significantly gloomier. And I think most people who have visited China in the last 2 months come back with some variant of the report that people are just not feeling very positive about things. So that's true. On the other hand, if you look at the data, what you see here is not, consumers have money, but they're not spending it because they're not confident. What you see here is, consumers don't have as much money as they used to have. Why? Well, because there was a pandemic. There were 2 phases of lockdowns in early 2020 and then in 2022. A lot of people lost income. They lost their jobs, lost their businesses. And the communist government did nothing for you. They said, you lost your job, you lost your income. Great, you're on your own. Good luck. See you at the end of the pandemic, basically. And this is very strikingly different to the United States. Capitalist United States, non-socialist United States said, we're shutting everything down because of the pandemic. Here, let's put a lot of money in your pocket twice, right? So those are the 2 spikes. What I'm showing here is nominal household income in aggregate relative to the previous pre-pandemic trend. That's what you see in both of these charts. Dotted lines are the pre-trends. The solid lines are the actual outcomes. And in the United States, you had not only these 2 big stimulus programs, but you can see that household incomes remained well above the previous trend long after the lockdowns had ended, because people came out into one of the tightest job markets in American history, and so were able to bid up wages. Now, a lot of this money got eaten up in inflation. In fact, real income has felt. But the reason that the U.S. has felt dynamic over the last couple of years is because there has been this huge burst of nominal income growth that fed a lot of spending and a lot of inflation. And I think a lot of people outside of China, particularly in the U.S., assumed that China would do the same thing. And if it didn't, that proved that there was something deeply wrong with China. And I think you can basically argue that the only thing deeply wrong with China in this regard is that they did not support people's incomes during COVID. And so what you can see also here is that the red line consumption fell more sharply than the blue line and has failed to come up. And that does reflect a confidence issue. People see that they're losing income, that their friends are losing income. So they hunker down. They say, we're not going to spend. We're going to save because we don't know where this is going to end. So it's precautionary saving against a kind of a macroeconomic shock for which the government was not providing any particular support. Now, if you look at the most recent numbers in the right end of the chart, what you can see is the income line has been steadily rising and is now back almost to the pre-pandemic trend. And the consumption line has been rising faster, which means that the savings rate, household savings rate, has been going down. So the propensity to consume out of your income is rising. And that does not seem to me an indication that people have permanently lost confidence in the system. I think it argues exactly the opposite, that while all of the COVID uncertainties were going on, people were very, very conservative. And it has taken them a while to get out of that because the growth in incomes has been slow, but it is happening. So I have a less metaphysical view of this loss of confidence in the consumer sector. I think it is basically an artifact of income effects that are gradually getting stabilized. And I also think that the difference between the China picture and the US picture explains some of the extreme reaction that we've seen in the United States to what's happened in China, because the assumption was that China would be exactly like the US. It wasn't, therefore something is wrong with China. And I think what's wrong with China is simply a macroeconomic mistake, arguably, that they didn't put enough money in consumers' pockets during the pandemic. Finally, there's a story that, private entrepreneurs don't want to invest. Well, we can certainly go to China. We can certainly talk to a lot of private entrepreneurs who are very gloomy and negative about things. But again, if you look at the data, total private sector fixed investment is the black line. And you can see the growth there is around 0. So that's not very good. However, a lot of private sector investment is in real estate because the majority of real estate developers are private. So the data enables us to disaggregate manufacturing from services, basically. Services includes real estate. And when you do that, you see that private sector investment in manufacturing is actually pretty robust. And in fact, growing stronger than it was in years prior to COVID. Now, I don't want to put a huge amount of weight on this because there are a lot of problems in the fixed asset investment data of a technical nature, which I don't want to go into, but it is very, very difficult to reconcile this data with the story that there's some kind of widespread malaise among private entrepreneurs. And you can certainly find many, many industries, particularly in these sort of tech-intensive sectors favored by the government, that seem to be doing fine. So again, a little bit of skepticism about the private entrepreneurs have given up on China. It's also interesting to me that the two big stories that came out of China this year, and they were in simultaneously, is number one, China's economy is going off the rails, it's collapsing, the Leninist bill is coming due, Xi Jinping has a failing model, it's all bad, bad, bad. Oh, China is also suddenly the world's biggest exporter of cars in the world. Bigger than Japan, bigger than Germany, bigger than South Korea. China is invading the world with electric vehicles that are not only cheap, but are higher quality and technologically more sophisticated than those of their European competitors. And this has all happened basically within the span of the last 2 or 3 years, as you can see here. So, and you can tell similar stories about China's position in clean energy industries and stuff like that. Is this really a situation where you have an economy that is, imploding or stagnating, and there's no dynamism or entrepreneurialism left in it? I am skeptical. I think it's more complicated than that. Okay, so having explained what I think is wrong with what everyone else thinks, I will put my cards on the table and suggest a better way of thinking about this, which incorporates, I think, a lot of the valid insights from these different critiques. Because as I said, I think all of these stories are getting at some things that are really there and we need to take seriously. Okay, so I think these are the sort of concepts that we want to keep in mind. First of all, the direction from the top, the policy settings at the very top of the system are different now than they have been at most points in the last 40 years of Chinese history. So the Communist Party's number one priority has always been to keep itself in power and to squash all alternatives. But for most of the last 40 years, the number two priority, which ran a very close second, was to maximize economic growth. And there was always like an interest in technology and stuff like that, but the leaders tended to be fairly agnostic about where the growth came from. Any kind of growth was good as long as you could be persuaded that they could keep doing it. And I think it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping just does not share this view. He does not view economic growth as an end in itself. And this is a real difference between him and all of his predecessors. If you do a word count of his speeches at the 5-year party congresses, you can see a steadily declining share of references to economic reform and a steadily rising share of references to security and technology, right? And I think that reveals what he's thinking about. So security, which is very broadly defined, self-sufficiency in technology, very important in part because the United States has decided that it wants to deny various kinds of technology to China permanently. So if you're a Chinese leader, you have to think about, okay, if we can't get it from the US, maybe we have to make it ourselves. Technological upgrading more generally, and social equity, making sure that the benefits of growth are spread more generally. And I think the ones to focus on for this discussion are really the security and the technology ones, and particularly technology. I think if you want to think of an index of success for Xi Jinping, it would be some index of China's technological capabilities, not its GDP. Because as long as China has the technology to advance, provide a good livelihood for most of its people and project its power internationally, I think he will be satisfied. And if lower growth rate comes along with that, he's not terribly fussed by it, right? So that's one point. I think, and I'll sort of, this will presage a thing I'll say at the end. I think he also is, the evidence is that she has a kind of a puritanical sort of view of things. One might almost call it Germanic in its economic manifestations. And, you know, I tend to think that he thinks that austerity is good for people. And this is, I think, clearly filtered down into the way the macroeconomy is being managed. And I'll come back at the end to elaborate on that a little bit more. Okay, so that's point one. Top level direction is no longer go for economic growth. It's go for security and go for technological upgrading. Second, it is very clear that there is a top-down process of capital reallocation going on here, because Chinese economic leaders have recognized, I think for several years, that the economy was too reliant on infrastructure, too reliant on property. These drivers had exhausted themselves and they needed something new. And if you read Chinese sort of economic strategy documents, basically what they say is, we need to have a technologically advanced society. And so technological development and upgrading is going to drive productivity and economic growth. That is where the capital needs to go. It needs to stop going to property and infrastructure, and it needs to start going to these other sectors. And, you know, if you strip the sort of top-down political rhetoric out of this, I think most ordinary economists would say, yeah, that's a good idea, actually, because these are sort of high productivity industries. These other things, the old drivers, are exhausted. So yes, we should see a capital reallocation from one to the other. Now, I think where people have problems is a lot of economists would like to see that being done by the market. And here it's the state saying, we're going to move it from here to there. But I think it's important to recognize that, okay, yeah, this is a politically driven decision, but it's also an economically fairly rational decision. I think it has some clear limitations. If you try to run an entire economy totally on the basis of industrial policy, I think you're limiting your options, but it's not crazy. And then third, and I've alluded to this before, is that you have this debt problem, which I view as not as a threat of collapse or even as necessarily something that dooms China to a particular growth rate, but as a constraint on policy. So you do have very, very high levels of debt. A lot of this is concentrated in entities affiliated to local governments, state enterprises, and so forth. There's a complex of entities that are affected by this. And working out all of these debt program problems is going to be the work of several years. So they're going to be dealing with this throughout the 2020s. But as I said before, I think the debt problem is fragmented, and it is not necessarily the case that the large debt problems in the infrastructure and property complex will retard the ability of the more productive parts of the economy to keep moving ahead. Not necessarily. Could happen. Okay. So if you accept these premises that these are kind of the three factors lurking in the background, What does this mean for the economy, the stuff that we really care about? So I put two negatives and one positives here. So the negative is, I think this is what we're seeing now, and I think this is likely to be a theme of the next several years, is I don't think China's economy is collapsing. I don't think they've hit some inflection point where they're, going into some kind of huge stagnation. But I do think that they have set themselves up for a chronic shortfall of aggregate demand. Because in the most simple sense, you have an enormous amount of demand that was created in the economy by all this investment in property and infrastructure. And now you're saying we have to cut that by some gigantic amount. Right now, it's about 40%. And we're going to substitute for that by investing a lot more in semiconductors and robots and AI and green energy and so forth. And if you do the arithmetic on it, it is very clear that the loss from the property infrastructure complex is much larger than the gain that you can reasonably expect to get from these industries. So you just have created a hole in aggregate demand on the investment side that you can't really fill in the way that you've said that you're going to fill it. Well, now there are other ways that you could fill it. You could say, okay, well, we can keep leveraging up, and they've said, no, can't do that. We have to keep a tight line on debt, and we have to force people to deleverage. And in fact, that's why we have a property problem in China today. It's because the government 3 years ago said there's too much debt in property, it's overextended. We have to force a deleveraging, even if it's very painful. So this is why I say it's a constraint on policy, is that it is very, very difficult when you have a cyclical downturn for the government to step in and say, oh, let's just loosen monetary policy for a little while and pump a bunch of money into the economy and get things going, and then we'll draw back later. They're very reluctant to do that. Third, you could say, well, okay, what about the consumer? People have been talking about rebalancing towards consumption for years. Why don't you set things up so that the consumer can be more of a driver of economic activity in China? And the answer is that basically the economic elite policymakers in China do not believe on that in principle. I don't think they have ever believed that rebalancing and making China more like a US-style consumer demand-driven economy is the correct thing to do. I think their model of how economies work is there is investment. If the investments are in the right high productivity things, this will create, all of this industrial capacity. This will create a lot of good jobs, high paying jobs, service jobs downstream from that. And so you'll get consumption as a byproduct of correct investment decisions. And this is fundamentally a sort of mercantilist way of thinking about it, that economy is about production. It's not about consumption. And it leads ultimately to, an investment heavy growth model, persistent trade surpluses, because you are always producing more than you're consuming. The consumption is a lag to production. And so you've always got a surplus of investment over consumption, which gives you a trade surplus. And I think this is just deeply embedded. This isn't just something that Xi Jinping or his colleagues came up with. I think this is deeply embedded for a long time in Chinese policy. And if they had any doubts about that, they were ended in 2008 with the global financial crisis, which I think they took the lesson from that the American model was not something that they wanted to pursue. And what they're more interested in doing is looking like Germany. And I'll come back to that. So I think if you want to come up with analogs to the sort of specific economic problems that we're seeing today in China, I think Japan in the 1990s is maybe not the best. There's no perfect analog. One is actually United States 10 years ago, and for most of the 2010s. You remember secular stagnation? This is a big thing. The US, it was just like dead, right? Because all of these forces had combined to make it impossible for productivity growth to come back. You had all kinds of people like Robert Gordon arguing that you'd had this productivity boom years ago, which is not replicated in the internet age, and so forth. And I think you can make a very strong case retrospectively that the problem in the 2010s in the United States was not secular stagnation. It was the fact that we didn't do enough to stimulate the economy after the financial shock of 2008, 2009, that we should have done a double or triple fiscal stimulus. We just had a problem of shortfall of aggregate demand because essentially an austerity mindset had taken over and captured the political system and made it impossible for anyone to seriously argue about just pumping a lot of money into the economy and seeing what happened. So I think there are very strong echoes of the kind of U.S. policy, economic policy discourse of a decade ago in China today. You could also look at Germany in the 1990s after it reunified, very major shock, a government that was really resistant to any kind of stimulating reforms, a lot of efforts to restructure the labor arrangements and so forth, and to focus on essentially the efficiency of investment at the expense of everything else. So not perfect analogs, but I think you can draw at least as convincing parallels between those episodes at China today as with the Japan. Okay, so that's, I think, a feature of China that we're going to be living with for a while. Second, and this is deeper, Yasheng Huang down at MIT wrote a book 15 years ago called Capitalism with Chinese Characteristics. And in this, he came up with a really useful concept called directional liberalism. And the problem he was trying to solve was, why was it that entrepreneurs in China in 1980s and 1990s who had no real property rights, no assurance that their investments wouldn't be confiscated by the state, how come they were so willing to invest and be entrepreneurial despite these problems? And basically his answer was, they saw that Deng Xiaoping and various other people at the top of the system were saying, this is the broad direction for China. Over the long haul, we're going to get more open, we're going to get more dynamic, there's going to be more markets, and yes, there'll be cycles along the way, but the direction is clear. And they bet on that direction. And I think that's a very powerful and useful insight for understanding the way that China developed, from the early 80s into the 2000s. And so I basically believe that. I think the problem is, if you believe that, you now have to agree that we are no longer in an era of directional liberalism. We are in an era of directional something else, not liberalism, a direction towards more centralized one party and one person rule, more control over every aspect of society, something that is decidedly not liberal. And I think this sense of that there's just been a clear sense of overall direction in China. It's complicated, but I think it's basically true. I think this explains why, lots of people who made their money in the early era are now feeling very dispirited. And I think it also explains a lot of the commentary outside China that says, well, you've changed this direction and this new direction cannot possibly work. I think if you look at the available evidence, it's not clear to me that this change in direction has yet really permanently damaged the dynamism and innovation of the Chinese economy, but you can easily imagine how it could, right? So that is, I think, to me, a more useful way, maybe of framing the opposing argument that we really have moved into a new era. But that's not something that happened this month or this year. That's something that's been growing over Xi's tenure. And it could change if Xi has a heart attack. Okay. Third consequence is, I think it's clear from all of this that we are likely to get slower growth. But slower growth can coexist with a lot of technological success. So China's economy has a terrible year, yet they become the world's biggest exporter of vehicles and world leader in electric vehicles. I think we have to be respectful of the fact that the manufacturing ecosystem that has grown up in China over the last 30 years is extremely powerful. There's a lot of embedded knowledge. There are a lot of networks, supplier networks. They cannot they're not going to go up in smoke. and they can't be moved anywhere else or replicated anywhere else with very much ease. Once you have a big industrial manufacturing base like this, it is very difficult to dismantle. It has a lot of momentum. And I think you can point to a lot of individual sectors where there's also significant innovation within these manufacturing industries currently. And I think this is important because when we talk about the problem of, security and a sort of more Orwellian security state, surveillance, and this loss of direction liberalism, that is really, really bad if you are Jack Ma running an e-commerce and fintech company. It is really, really bad if you are Pony Ma and you are running a social media platform. It is very, very bad for people in sort of these highly visible internet service platform industries, which basically rely on social mobilization and the accumulation of huge amounts of personal data. Why? Because they are a potential political threat to the regime. These types of concerns do not apply, I think, so much if you are making electric vehicles or batteries or looking at the next cancer drug or all kinds of things. And I think there's been a lot of work to suggest that in these sort of less visible, more sometimes described as hardware sectors, the sort of concerns about the bad direction of China politically and socially are much less. And it's much, much less of a detriment to their innovative capacity. I think over the very long run, it's kind of hard to see a really innovative economy thriving in a political system that is becoming as dark and as controlled as China seems to be becoming. But I think that could be a very long transition before all of the elements of dynamism are wrung out of the system. Okay, so a few concluding remarks to try and add it all up. So where do I think China is headed? So first of all, I think a lot of the China slowdown rhetoric is kind of like, yeah, of course, China's getting richer. As countries get richer, they slow down. So here we've plotted China's growth rate, per capita GDP growth rate, against its level of income. So as you go from left to right on the chart, you get richer. And we've plotted it against the other big East Asian economies with whom China shares many features. And what is noticeable is that China is pretty much doing the same thing that Taiwan, Japan, Korea, Singapore did in their heyday. It is not an outlier. It does not seem to be moving out of this pattern in any dramatic way. This is a smoothed figure. If you look, I do have a chart that shows the unsmoothed figure. So for 2020, China is down here at 2%. Then the next year was up at 8%. And this year it's probably going to be somewhere in the middle. So very volatile because of COVID. But if you look at the trend, it's not clear that they're falling off the cliff. So I think part of what's going on is that China is just naturally hitting a period of significantly slower growth. I think it's unreasonable to expect them to keep growing as fast as Korea and Taiwan did at a similar stage, because Korea and Taiwan are much smaller. Their export economies could be a huge part of the total economic picture. They could rely a lot on external demand. China's just too big for that. Can't do that. The other interesting thing is if you look at Japan, which is the low man on the totem pole in this chart, you can see, yeah, that after reaching China's current level of income, Japan only grew by like 3.5% for the next decade. That decade was not the 1990s, it was the 1980s, when most people thought Japan was this ultra dynamic economy that was going to take over the world tomorrow, right? So the point here is simply to say that we need to be a little bit careful about saying, okay, China is now going to grow at some more normal rate than we're used to, a lot lower. It may not even grow fast enough to ever catch up with the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean that it is an economy without dynamism and without a lot going on. And I think that's failing to sort of put those two things together is a flaw in some of the negativity that we see here. If you look at China's technological gains, very difficult to measure because there's no single index. But one thing I look at is just China's share of global manufactured exports. And the hypothesis here is very simple. If you're going to be competitive in exporting manufactured goods to the rest of the world, you cannot do this on a long-term basis purely by being the cheapest game at. That leads nowhere. If you are going to be really successful, you have to keep upgrading your technology. So an increase or a maintenance of a high level of global manufactured goods export share, to me, is prima facie evidence of strong technological foundations. And if you look at the red line here, that is China's share of global manufactured exports. It's obviously gone up quite a lot. It's now sitting around 20%. There's some uncertainty about what the exact trend is right now. There are different ways that you can measure. But broadly speaking, China is a very, very competitive across a very wide spectrum of goods in global export markets. And this competitiveness does not come from a cheap currency or just cost advantages, because China's labor actually is not all that cheap by global standards anymore. It clearly comes from technological advantages as well. And if you look at the absolute numbers, the blue bars, you can see that there was just a gigantic increase in Chinese exports the last couple of years. The other key thing is it used to be most of China's exports were produced by foreign companies operating on Chinese soil. And so you can say, well, there's kind of this enclave economy, multinationals and their suppliers like Foxconn are using China as a platform, but this really isn't reflective of indigenous technological advantages in China. It's just reflective of the fact that they have a huge labor force and pretty good infrastructure. But this is no longer true. So if you look at the foreign invested enterprise share of Chinese exports, as recently as a decade ago, it was over 50%. It is now down to 30%. I mean, 70% of this rapidly rising volume of Chinese exports is coming from domestic firms, largely private or private-ish. Meg and I can have a debate about whether there are any private companies left in China today. Entrepreneurial. So again, what this suggests is that we're not just seeing China as like a vessel for other people to do their stuff in. China is actually becoming more technologically competent. So slower growth, but significant areas of technological excellence. Where I would conclude on China is, as I've been hinting all along, I think Xi Jinping's vision for China is one of what I would call a Leninist Germany. The idea is we want to be an investment-led, technologically developed country with huge trade surplus, self-sufficient in everything, low debt rates, virtuous in that sense. And that's what we want. And I'm not so concerned. Germany doesn't have the highest GDP growth rate in the world, but it is a better economy and more socially stable than a place like the United States, which is a higher growth rate, but all of these horrible social problems that we in China do not want to emulate. So my intuition is that that's kind of what he's pushing for. You can see a lot of Chinese documents that indicate that there's a desire to keep the level of manufacturing as a share of GDP high and not deindustrialize in the same way that the United States has. So a German or a Korean type of model is what I think most likely growth rate for China over the rest of this decade is somewhere in 3 to 3.5% range, so a lot lower than we've seen in the past, lower than we have now. And I think Xi will accept this as long as he sees the technology growing the way that he needs to. So I think, you can put some positive spins on this. One is if China grows at 3% over the next 7 years and India grows by 6%, the amount of incremental demand created by China over that period will be double that in India. So the base in China is so high, slower growth, still have a lot more absolute growth. So the volume effects, I think, are really important. Another thing I think that is worth bearing in mind when we look at the China-Japan comparison is looking back, I think you can say that one of the reasons that Japan really went off the rails as much as it did in the 1990s in terms of going from being a leader in the global economy to a pretty distant follower was that it missed the single biggest shift in the global economy in the 1990s, which was the shift to the internet. It became sort of this island. It cut itself off from the internet as a whole, never really mastered the whole networking thing. And that had huge implications, for example, their semiconductor industry and various other things. China, arguably, it's cut itself off from the global internet, but it has a pretty gigantic internet of its own, so it's probably okay there. But the bigger issue is that China has not cut itself off from what appears to be the major shift of this coming era, which is the green energy transition. In fact, it's a leader in that era. So again, I think there's a question about, is China missing the point of what's going on in the world, or are they actually doing a pretty good job of anticipating new changes? You can argue that they're doing a good job. I think the biggest question, though, is I think this problem of increased authoritarianism, surveillance, decreased personal freedom. Most of the literature on innovation suggests that it thrives when you have maximum connections between different unrelated fields. And a lot of innovation comes from just people making unexpected connections that you cannot predict in advance. And if you have a highly controlled political system, these become much, much more difficult to achieve. So over the long run, I think there is considerable risk. This system that I've outlined here leads to a situation where, yeah, China is very good at this or that technological thing, but this is not a dynamic ecosystem. These are sort of an isolated archipelago of technological success stories set in a very, very calm, motionless, non-growing sea around them. That is a real risk. And so that's why I say that she has this vision, but there is a risk, not today, but over a period of time, that you create the stagnation in China because of the political controls. I think I will stop there. I have a couple more things to say about what this means in terms of sort of external influence by the Belt and Road. I also had a little bit of material on the interactions with the US, but I think probably I've given you enough to think about and talk about for now, and we can pick up some of those themes maybe in the discussion. So at this point, I believe, Meg, you are going to be the mocker of the microphone.
First we clap.
Oh.
I will call on people, but let me take my prerogative. First say, I do believe there are private firms in China, but also to ask a couple of questions, and I'll try and make them quick. So the first is, you said almost nothing until the final slide about external influence, and you meant China's influence in the rest of the world. So it's interesting, reading the basic, reading the basic statements. The Chinese officials are clearly saying it's a hard rebalancing for our economy, which is exactly what you're saying, and the external environment is bad. Yeah. So what is the effect of the external environment? Have U.S. restrictions had any impact? And then, this may be a question to think about later, because I realize you're an economist and not a political scientist, but this is, of course, your fault, and I have to still ask you this, which is the thing that makes Germany stable, right, is its large social welfare net.
Yes.
So if China's economy has high-tech manufacturing in green energy sectors or in new, high-tech manufacturing sectors, that's not going to employ or enrich the wide swath of, in particular, the urban middle class in China, the way that the last growth model has. Yeah. So is it politically stable to see such a transition in China?
Okay, well, I actually never took an economics course, so I can't claim to be an economist. I usually present myself as a political economist, so I will
because there's no course.
Address the second question with great enthusiasm. But on the first one, no question that there's a lot of concern in China about basically the breakdown in relations with the United States, the fact that, you had this trade war with Trump. I think there had been some hope that when Biden came in, there would be some modulation of that, and there was none, basically. And in fact, a much more disciplined and effective approach to cutting off key technologies. And I think they were extremely unhappy about that. And that's what lies behind this sort of defensive hunkering down. We have to provide for our own security and self-sufficiency because it is a hostile environment. So when they talk about the hostile environment, I think they're mainly talking about the US. And I think there's a question there, right? And so I think the next shoe to fall here, so we clearly have seen, some trade effects, some loss of access to technology. But the thing that has been very noticeable in the last few months, and I didn't include it here for various reasons, one of which is hard to know what the trend is. Foreign direct investment way down, and venture capital investment way down, right? And I don't think we know enough for sure how permanent these drops are, but it sure feels like whatever the amount of FDI and VC money was coming into China over the last 10 or 15 years, what comes in the next 10 or 15 years is going to be substantially less than that. I think that is almost certainly true. And the question is, how much does that matter? And I honestly don't know, right? I think there's a tendency in the West to say, oh, this is really important. The Chinese would never be able to succeed unless it was our wonderful, insights and capital that helped them along. And I think that's a little bit, grandiose. But it's clearly the case that FDI and VC capital had major catalytic effects. And we just don't know. Is China mature enough now that they don't really need that stuff? They can generate the capital on their own. The markets are sufficiently functional that they can substitute for that. Or is there some secret sauce that is really going to be lost? And that is, I think, a real risk. And that I think that's way more important than the controls on semiconductors, et cetera, which are in fact very narrowly targeted and are bad for the individual industries targeted, but macroeconomically are really not that important. Okay, so that would be my answer in the first one. On the second one, I guess there's a difference between, I was simply describing what I think is the theory of the Chinese leadership, not saying, and that is a correct and analytically perfect theory. I think you are absolutely right to point out there are a lot of elements of the German social contract that are not simply covered by industrial policy. I will say, if you look at the social safety net in China, it is pretty threadbare by Western standards, but it's a lot better than what they had 10 or 15 years ago. You can go to pretty much any remote countryside village. There will be some kind of healthcare facility. Everyone has some kind of a pension at this point, not very much. And I think the philosophy there has been that they want to create wide coverage for social welfare, make sure everyone has something, but keep the level very low because they've seen the problems that advanced countries have gotten into by overpromising on welfare and leading to unsustainable fiscal situations. So I think there's a logic to that, and it is a cogent logic, and it is a logic which I think consciously addresses the question of what do we need to do to make China stable. We think this is okay, and I think they're probably right about that. I think the deeper question is, as you pointed out, are they going to be able to generate enough high quality employment? Fortunately, the working age population is now shrinking very rapidly. So this is a slightly less urgent problem than it was before, but you still have a lot of people to deal with. And indeed, that is a potential pitfall of this strategy.
Thanks. All right, so if you have questions, raise your hand. Okay, so Dinda will come over here first. And just introduce yourself briefly.
Is that mic working?
Yeah, it's a little hard to hear. Closer.
Why not shell on the axe instead of just why not an axe? So that's considering. Secondly, you kind of frame the transition in China, both transition.
Yeah, just finish the question, Allison.
the hesitance behind that to be more of an institutionalized belief in Beijing that a heavy top-down, heavy investment, heavy strategy works better than nothing.
Yes.
So
Okay.
what do you see the argument?
Yeah. So the basic question is, why hasn't the government done more to stimulate the economy in various means than it has done? And I think the answer, I mean, as Meg alluded to, certainly the official answer from the government is we are going through a necessary transition. And so we shouldn't be propping up, if we stimulated, we would essentially be propping up the old sectors that need to shrink. So that is not in long-term interest. We need to just suck it up and accept the pain and undergo this structural transformation that will lead us to a better place. That's the official view. There's certainly a lot of debate on this. In fact, you probably saw there was a headline today about Yi Gang, former head of the central bank, saying, you know what, we're not stimulating enough. We need to pump more money in the economy. So there are plenty of people in the Chinese system who believe that this is just a mistake and that you don't have to be so, excuse my language, hard-assed about austerity. You can achieve the structural transformation, but still do more to support growth. But that clearly is not what's being done now. And I think the other potential explanation is that messaging from the top has been a little bit unclear. And this is a complaint that you get a lot in China, that, and this was very much the case during COVID and in the exit from COVID, that people don't want to do things because they're not sure what the top guy wants, and they would rather do nothing than make a mistake. So I think we don't know for sure how much of the current policy mix is a completely deliberate, carefully thought out strategy, and how much is just like an artifact of bureaucrats making sort of opportunistic decisions and not moving because they think it might get them into trouble, and the top guy not giving a sort of a clear sense of what he wants, right? I think both of those interpretations are out there. But I tend to believe that there's like, and again, I remember 10 years ago, we just like had a political consensus in 2010, 2012 that, oh, you couldn't stimulate, it would be terrible, moral hazard, all kinds of horrible inflationary, terrible things would happen if you pump more money into the economy. And the price that we paid in the United States for that was 10 years of below potential growth and kind of a political revolution when people got unhappy with that. So it's not just in China that you can sort of get people committed to a sort of a moral, virtuous path of economic pain as the route to gain. So I think there's probably some analogs there, just in terms of the political debate within China, some analogs of that to what we went through here 10 years ago.
All right, maybe we'll do two at a time this time,
yes,
just to see. Do you have your question up? Oh, well, you have the mic.
I got the mic.
Yeah.
Okay. So my question is kind of a follow-up to what you're talking about now, which is it's really about the sort of psychological and political aspects of what we're seeing unfold. And, you know, for the past many decades, we've all thought of there being a kind of a social contract, which was, you know, tremendous economic growth, your incomes will increase dramatically, all that kind of stuff. Don't play politics, you know, we'll have control over that side of things. And that was pretty much okay to people. So the question is, if you don't have that kind of economic growth going forward, but you have increasing, you know, tightening in the political area, is that, you know, sustainable? What will happen?
Yep, good. So do you want to take the second one?
Yeah, you can. And then the second question here.
So it seems social process, and also the no longer developing the real estate, such as that we will be having if not lost, but at least no continuing in growth in the welfare of the most family, which is predominantly real estate. And if majority of the people no longer have the benefits of economic growth, but it looks like your presentation shows to be clear, which is going to be the owners of manufacturing the capitalists that will enjoy most of the benefits.
Right. Yes. Right.
So in that sense, why do you still promote in China the policy to be relaxed or financial markets to be continuing to grow? Is that a possible way to shield or harbor this wealth that people want to grow? Or
so wait, are you asserting that there is a policy for growth of the financial markets, and you're asking why that policy exists? Or
yes, that's not fire.
Right.
That's growth in the financial markets. Will be the next phase when the real estate market or the other that's traditionally people that's their family wealth of.
Okay, good. All right. So on the social contract, but you can create new social contracts, I think. And I think that's what these various invocations of the China dream and so forth are about, is to try and steer people towards a more traditional understanding of, the virtuous life and the correct relationship between the rulers and the ruled, right? So I think there is a fairly extensive propaganda effort going on to shift away from that old social contract, precisely so you don't get nailed when people say, well, why is my income not growing at 10 or 15% a year? And I think, the anti-corruption campaign fits into this. My observation is that this is very popular with most people. There was a sense that, everyone's votes were rising, but some people's votes were rising a lot faster than everyone else's. And it's good that some of those people got in jail. So I think there are a lot of legitimacy strategies that the government can apply even in the context of lower growth, if they make sure that enough of various kinds of benefits are spread around sufficiently equally, and that you have some growth so that people do have a sense that there is forward motion, even if it's less than the past. On the second question, that's an interesting one, because there was a lot of work done 15, 20 years ago to show that as China industrialized, basically the income share of capital rose and the income share of labor fell. So if you have an industrial policy driven growth model, that could imply that you are sort of setting up a situation where maintaining sort of the income of laborers is going to be a problem. I think the way the government would see this, first of all, is that the real monopoly problems were in the internet sector, which are, in fact, the network effect's very powerful. You do have monopoly power. And so if you had an economy focused around these internet platform companies, a few people would get really, really rich and everyone else would be like a delivery guy. And I think their view is that by cracking down on that and trying to redirect things towards, more hard technologies, if you will, that actually is intrinsically more equitable. It's a good question. I think financially, it's just like they understand that there's they don't have a financial system that really fully satisfies all the needs of a modern economy, so they need to keep developing it. That's why they keep giving licenses to foreign asset managers to come in and so forth. I think that is an area where they feel like there's just a set of technologies that needs to be improved. But I think that's kind of a distinct effort from, it's in a separate bucket conceptually from the whole industrial policy sort of tendency of policy.
Oh, Bill is behind you.
Bill Shell, I'm a retired professor of economics, but I specialize in health economics, but I'm not a threat to you. My question is this. Before this recent change, economists talk about China going to have time to move to the next phase of growth with the middle income trap.
Yep.
And with the financial market needs major reform in China. And have to change the saving habits and investment of the people. Meanwhile, you're giving a projection, even on the low end, it's 3 to 3.5% growth. Can you explain how do you derive that number as a trend in light of the problem we already know China faced to move from one stage of economic to another stage?
Okay.
We'll take one more if there's another hand up down here in the front.
Yes.
Thank you. Been just working for it over here.
So my name is Alex. I was born in China, but I studied master's.
Can you hold the microphone?
And right now I'm doing a PhD in education here. And so just 3 hours ago, People's Daily published an article essentially saying we need a stronger state-owned enterprise sector. And I think they shifted the value proposition a little bit. Like now they could invest longer-term industry than other companies, private companies do marketing. It's slower, it's longer, and it's hard technology.
Yeah.
Do you think that's going to work out long-term in terms of both boosting the economy and bringing the private company into those industries?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So the first question, I think you probably exaggerate the depth of our econometric precision at Gavekal Dragonomics. So the number that I'm throwing out there is a very kind of impressionistic, this is where I think they could potentially go. And it's not based on a sort of a systematic growth accounting exercise. But it's based on, first of all, the precedents that if you look at Japan, Korea, Taiwan, which shared a lot of features with China's economy, this is what they were able to do. So that, to me, kind of sets the bounds of what could be plausible. It's not a guarantee that you will do it. So that's point one. Point two, I think I've spent like over 30 years of my life looking at this, and one of the constant features is that outside observers, I think, have quite consistently underestimated the resilience, dynamism, and adaptability of the Chinese economy and, in fact, the governance system, right? And so long before people were talking about the middle income trap, they were talking about, various other terrible things that would happen in China, from financial collapse to in the early 2000s, there was a theme of Latin Americanization of China because of rising inequality and so forth. And every time that one of these challenges has risen, things have emerged to deal with it. So I've grown to have a lot of respect for the adaptability of the system. And I guess the other sort of key component of my analysis here is that when I look at the micro level, at what they have been able to achieve in a wide swath of manufacturing sectors, it's extremely impressive, right? And the entrepreneurial ecosystem that exists there is very, very robust. So it really boils down to a question of, are the policymakers smart enough to give that thing enough space to grow? If so, then there is literally no problem, right? The problem in China, as I'm sure you know, is that there's always a tendency at the center to try and control things more than necessary. And given that Xi Jinping is a control freak and he's now in office for life, and we know that for dictators, the quality of decision-making just degrades over time, yeah, there is no doubt a risk that that the life of the economy could be squeezed out gradually over time. The reason that I am not sort of jumping to that conclusion as the base case now is that Xi Jinping has a lot of goals relating to the wealth and power of the Chinese state. He wants China to be a great power. He wants it to be internationally influential. And he's not going to be able to get those things unless there is some degree of vitality in the economy. So I think at some level, he is still, to some degree, a economic rationalist who is not going to tip over into a situation where the political system just makes economic growth impossible. But you're kind of making a bet on one guy's psychology there, and it does not make me feel very comfortable. And on the question of SOEs, well, I haven't seen that particular report. This has obviously been a theme for a long time, that there's a lot of interest in increasing the role of the state-owned enterprises. One of my colleagues did an analysis recently, a couple of years ago, actually looked at the state-owned enterprise share of Chinese economy over a very long period of time, basically from 1995 to 2018 or so, and it was basically static at around 30%. Did not go up, it did not go down, the composition changed. And the conclusion that we came to from that exercise was that there's a revealed preference in the Chinese Communist Party to have a significant state role in the economy, but it does not have to be an absolute majority share of the economy. And I think as long as that is the case, you can have the state-owned enterprises coexisting with the entrepreneurial sector, and it kind of works fine. I think the question is whether these kinds of policy directives ultimately lead to more and more predatory behavior, where more and more private enterprises get, one way or another, sucked into the state system or become vassals of state-owned enterprises. I think we've seen some elements of that happening. I'm not particularly concerned about an individual policy announcement, because those come all the time, and there are always people who have to say, yes, we are in favor of the state-owned enterprise sector. What I'm more interested in is what the actual organizational dynamics are. And it's still, at the moment, it still seems like there's a pretty significant space for the entrepreneurial side of the economy to do its thing. But again, subject to all of the risks of what happens if you have an over-controlling central presence in power for too long.